All right, welcome. Another thrilling lesson, section or chapter 3. Okay, let's go. Let's see what we got. All right, boom, biodiversity. I think I've been mentioning this term, so here's the official definition, which we might have already done. I can't really remember. So if we think about it, all the different species that exist on Earth, we have about 2 million. So that's animals, maybe just animals that might be bigger if we talk about plants and bacteria, because there's lots of different ones, but I think this might be 2 million animal species. But we basically, from 5 to, total number of species from about 5 to 100 million. So ecologists, their job is to document the biodiversity on Earth. What is this term biodiversity? Well, we know the term diversity. We hear that term often, and we know the term bio now, which means living, right? So just the different living things. Specifically, the number and variety of life forms in a specific region. So number and variety. Basically, biodiversity is talking about all the different living things in a particular area. So an area that has very high biodiversity could have many different species, or it could have lots of a single type of species, but you can still refer to it as biodiversity, right? And so that's our new term. Diverse ecosystems need to be sustainable. We've talked about sustainable ecosystems before. Preserving and protecting individual species ecosystems they inhabit are critical to maintaining biodiversity on Earth. Without sustainable ecosystems, not as many organisms can live there. If there's not as many organisms, you have low biodiversity. So how do you measure it? Canopy fogging, quadrat sampling, transect sampling, or netting are the 4 examples that we're going to talk about. How we can basically count the number of animals that are in an area. So the one that you pick, any of those 4, depends on the type of organisms that you're counting and on the habitat that you're measuring. So each of these 4 are good for different scenarios and different organisms. Okay, no handout. So let's talk about biodiversity in Canada. We obviously have aquatic and terrestrial. Lots of different species, plants, insects, fungi, small invertebrates are far more diverse than larger animals. So the smaller the things are, the more diverse they happen to be, i.e. like fungi, bacteria, stuff like that, right? As well as insects, compared to larger animals, right? Because it takes more energy for larger animals. 5,000 species of plants have been identified in Canada. Animal species such as the prairie caribou, I think this is it here, are only found in Canadian Arctic and Greenland, so Canadians have responsibility for the welfare of these animals. Let's talk about some hotspots of biodiversity in Canada. So a biodiversity hotspot, is where there is an exceptionally large number of species in a relatively small area. So some of our hotspots in Ontario are Carolinian Canada and the Leitrim wetlands. We can see them down here. The Carolinian Canada is down where we are, very southern Ontario. And then sort of on the tip of, on the other side of Lake Huron, on Georgian Bay, there's a biosphere reserve that has lots of different organisms in them. So you can have hotspots, but in Canada, take a minute, just what we'll do is we'll do another quick pause. Why don't you think about another hotspot in the world? Okay, pause. Okay, good. What did you say? I was thinking of the Amazon rainforest, or rainforests in general tend to be hotspots of biodiversity as well in the world. So if you were thinking that, then hey, that's great. Okay, Carolinian Canada is an area of deciduous forest in southern Ontario. It makes up only 1% of Canada's landmass, but it has a higher number of species than any ecosystem in Canada. So that's pretty impressive. 2,200 plant species, and about 40% of Canada's bird species in that one area, so that's pretty crazy. And the wetlands, near-ish to Ottawa, I guess, and is home to about 200 species of plants and 90 species of birds, given special status, extra protection from development, i.e. building houses or industries in the area. so they've been protected. And then tropics, like we mentioned, most of the diversity are in tropics of South America, Africa, and Asia. There's greater biodiversity of animal and plant species in ecosystems near the equator because they tend to be tropical rainforests, right? Or maybe even coral reefs for the aquatic ecosystems, compared to those near the north or south poles due to abiotic factors such as high temperature, greater amounts of rainfall. So those places near the equator tend to will have more rainfall, and they'll also have higher temperatures compared that to places nearer to the Arctic zones, because the colder it gets, the ground freezes and you have a thing called permafrost, which means that it's difficult for large plants to grow. If there's not a lot of plants, you can't support a lot of animal life, hence low biodiversity in places like the Arctic. Not to say that you don't find animals, but remember that it is just the number of animals. So if you go to the Arctic, maybe there's going to be, if you go to the North Arctic, maybe there's going to be some polar bears, those snowshoe hares, things like that, seals. But if you go to a jungle somewhere, there's going to be tons and tons of insects, lots of different plants, snakes, birds, all those things. So just a lot more animals in there. So here's some examples of different biodiversity hotspots. Let's talk about what a community is. We mentioned the term population. A community is now one step larger than a population, because a community is all the populations of the different species that interact in a specific area or ecosystems. Remember what a population was? So again, get the definition in your head. Okay, pause. Okay, good. So population is just all the one type of species, whereas a community is a collection of populations. So many different types of species within a community, within an ecosystem. So certain species have a greater impact on a community or an ecosystem, which makes sense, right? This can be because they have a high population or they perform a critical ecosystem service. So there's three types of species that impact communities. They are the dominant species, what's called a keystone species, and then these things called ecosystem engineers. Basically, some species have more of an impact on ecosystems than others. Let's talk about how a dominant species has an impact, or what the dominant species role is within an ecosystem. The dominant species is the thing that has the biggest biomass of any other community member. So the specific species that there's just the most of. In terrestrial ecosystems, dominant species are always primary producers because the biomass of consumers is always less than producers' biomass. So what that means is that in a terrestrial ecosystem, the dominant species is probably always going to be a plant of some kind. The removal of a dominant species can result in a decrease in biodiversity in an ecosystem, which makes sense, right? If you take away the biggest thing, the one with the most biomass, then there's less to eat, right? Especially if it's going to be a producer. So there's less food for other organisms, so you're going to see a decrease in the biodiversity. Removing primary producers can have significant effects on organisms at higher trophic levels of a food chain that depend on the primary producer. So that kind of makes sense, right? Similar to that bottom-up regulation. Now, a keystone species is different, obviously, than a dominant species. Well, how is it? Now, a keystone species is a species that can greatly affect population numbers and the health of an ecosystem. Keystone species are generally not abundant and can be plants or animals. So the dominant species, there's a lot of it, right? That's the only definition for dominant species. What's the impact of removing all of the dominant species is hard to do because there's the most of them. But if you remove the dominant species, then there's less food for things, right? That just sort of makes sense. The keystone species, though, is a specific organism that affects the population numbers of other organisms as well. So the keystone species could be also the dominant one, right? But it doesn't have to be. So dominant species, keystone species, they can overlap, but they don't have to. Let's look at an example of a keystone species. A sea otter is an example of and prairie dogs. So sea otters keep the number of sea urchins in check, right? So that because these urchins eat the kelp and the sea otters eat the urchins. So if there's not as many urchins, then the kelp can grow, right? And then the kelp can provide food, right, for fish, which we need. So the sea otters are maintaining a balance there, right? Prairie dogs also help to increase plant diversity, turn over tons of soils, increase nitrogen content in soil, and allow deep water penetration of the soil. So as prairie dogs are burrowing underground, they are helping to increase the nitrogen content of the soil to help along that nitrogen cycle like we talked about way back in chapter 1. If either of these species were to go away, so you notice that if there's something like a sickness or if sea otters are hunted or something or whatever, if something disrupts these organisms, then if there's no sea otters, then the urchins can now grow unchecked. If too many urchins grow, they eat all the kelp. If there's no kelp, then fish don't have anything to eat, and we see that the whole ecosystem falls out of balance. So the removal of a keystone species, right, like all the animals of this one species can affect the health of the ecosystem. And so that's why they're called keystone species. And then we can go to ecosystem engineers. There are species that cause such dramatic changes to landscapes that it creates new ecosystems, right? So beavers are an example of engineers, right? Because they build things, right? They can turn a small stream into an aquatic ecosystem. By putting up that dam, they will slow the water down to make it like a pond in different areas that provide beavers with safety and a food supply of aquatic plants. But other species, fish, birds, amphibians, and insects find food sources and a home from a beaver pond ecosystem, right? So the natural ecosystem is essentially disrupted by the organism, but you notice that there's a positive benefit here, right? The beavers will build a dam, but then you can create these kind of smaller ecosystems where other organisms can find some protection, right? So ecosystem engineers obviously help, can help change the face of ecosystems, right? Captive breeding and succession. Okay, captive breeding is breeding rare, endangered, or critical wildlife in controlled settings to increase the population size, right? Since 92, the Toronto Zoo is a facility involved in captive breeding of black-footed ferrets back from the brink of extinction. Another example you might have heard of is with pandas. Pandas have difficulty reproducing in the wild, so almost all of modern pandas, I think, are a result of captive breeding. Oh goodness gracious me, Tiger King, if you saw Tiger King, that's captive breeding, right? These poor tigers are in these cages, but they're not allowed out, and they have, they get pregnant and give birth all while in captivity. Now that can be beneficial because some like the pandas that they can't reproduce in the wild or they have difficulty with it, so that means that they might face extinction otherwise. So we perform this, so humans help by putting them in cages basically and essentially forcing them to breed. You can get more offspring and hopefully grow the population. So some controversy, I think, among captive breeding, depending on what it is, but for endangered species, it can be a beneficial thing because you can get the numbers up and then hopefully reintroduce them into the wild. Now, this concept of succession, I talked about a little bit. We don't cover it in too much detail, but it is very interesting. So succession is a series of changes in an ecosystem that occurs over time following a disturbance, like a natural disturbance like a hurricane, or some sort of human action like deforestation, cutting down trees, right? Succession occurs in a number of stages where each stage restores equilibrium by increasing the number and type of plant and animal species in an ecosystem following a disturbance. The biggest example of this is that I always remember is volcanic eruptions. After a volcano erupts, all the lava will destroy any ecosystems nearby, and then the lava turns into rock, right? So what's left over is all of these ecosystems have been destroyed, just literally covered in rocks. How can anything go back to growing there, right? Well, over a long period of time, the rocks can get broken down by these things, tiny plant organisms called lichens. They break them down, turn them into soil, and then you can start getting smaller plants growing through these rocks, eventually creating more fertile soil, which leads to the growth of larger plants. And then as this is happening, you're going to have animals coming in using these plants for shelter or for food. And then over a long period of time, thousands of years, I think maybe a time scale around there, you're going to see a change that a place that once was just covered in volcanic rock can eventually turn into a forest, right? That's how we get all of our modern ecosystems maybe not all, but a lot of them would have come from this, right? The Hawaiian Islands are sort of an example of this, or maybe most island chains, because they are the result of just volcanic activity. So when you think about it, they were just a big rocks in the middle of the ocean, and then they had some sort of plant species brought there that caused this succession to occur, and now you have very fertile, biodiverse areas, like on the Hawaiian Islands, right, with lots of different animal species, terrestrial animal species, because of succession occurring over time. I want to show you something quick. We're going to just do a real fast one. But if I look up keystone, I should be able to find. I'm not going to be able to find it. Aha, yes. Just wanted to show you this. Take a look at this. Open image, a new tab. If we look at this picture here, this term keystone comes literally from this term here. When you're building an arch like this, I'm sure that you've seen these. You have this guy in the middle that's called a keystone, because you put this stone in first and build the other ones around it. I don't know how to do it, but you build these other stones. The reason it's called a keystone, if I were to knock this stone out, right? So someone's built this arch. If I took like a sledgehammer and knocked this single stone out, the whole arch would collapse, right? And then I wouldn't have this structure anymore. So it's a key, to the stability of the structure. That's why we call these animals keystone species. If you remove them, right? If you knock this one stone out, everything else falls apart. So that's why they're called keystone species. Great. Okay, thanks so much, and hopefully this was informative. See you guys soon.